In a previous video, we discussed what the EU actually is. We found that it's unique, not a state, but more than just an international organisation like the United Nations. This is because the EU is allowed to do more than those organisations are. In fact, the EU is the only body in the world that can make laws by itself without being a state. In this video, we'll explain what the EU does, how it makes laws, and why the EU is structured the way it is. If you haven't heard already, we've started a Patreon account for TLDR EU, where you can support this channel and get great perks, including exclusive pin badges, early access to videos, and thanks at the end of every video. Also, we allow all $3 and up patrons to vote for the topics we make videos on, and there's a poll up at the moment, so if you want to vote, sign up now. There's a link in the description. So let's make a start. Take a breath, because this could get a little complicated. Though it's not as complex as all the prorogation and crazy UK constitution stuff we've dealt with before. Let's begin by taking a look at an ordinary state that we can compare the EU to. Power in democratic states is divided according to the theory of separation of powers. Basically, it divides power between three ruling branches. One branch gets to make rules but cannot execute them. This branch, the legislature, is usually a parliament. Think the House of Commons in the UK. Another branch is the executive, who have the power to execute rules but cannot make them. This is the executive power normally thought of as the government. And the third branch gets to overrule all of the others and wields supreme legal power, but cannot use these powers unless specifically asked to. This is the judiciary power, or the courts in a country, with the highest courts even interpreting the Constitution, like the Supreme Court in the United States. So far so good. A state has an exclusive right to govern itself and its own affairs to its own liking. This means that a state is sovereign. It answers to nobody but itself. The principle of sovereignty is the crucial reason as to why the EU powers cannot be easily separated. That's because the Union itself is not sovereign. It doesn't hold all of the standard powers that will be divided along these three branches. Also, it cannot simply overrule member states, because those are states, and thus they're sovereign. So what kind of power does the EU have? Well, any power it does have has been given to it by the member states, and ultimately they did this by agreeing to the Lisbon treaties. The EU has received sovereignty parts from member states, which it uses to make laws that bind member states. In union language, this so-called sovereignty gift is called CONFERRAL. Because the sovereignty of the member states must be protected, the Lisbon treaties are very specific on the areas the union has power to make laws in, and which it doesn't. The treaties call these areas where the EU has power its competences. For instance, the EU has exclusive competence to make laws related to the customs union, but it shares competence with the member states to make laws on the environment. As the very first article of the Treaty of the EU nicely summarises, by this treaty, the high contracting parties establish among themselves a European Union, on which the member states confer competences to attain objectives they have in common. Bearing that in mind, how should we look at the EU structure? Well, this is something that not all scholars agree on. Even after a thorough explanation like ours, the EU remains a bit of a strange thing, even for lawyers and political theorists. But most of them would agree that one other model comes much closer to explaining it than separation of powers. This model is called interest representation. Interest representation is a good way of describing the uniqueness of the EU structure, and the way in which important things like sovereignty, conferral, and competences are dealt with. The interest representation model distinguishes between the interests of the three groupings that the European Union protects. These are the member states, the EU citizens, and the EU as a whole. Each of these groups has one institution that protects its interests. Citizens' interests are protected by the European Parliament, which is directly elected by them every 5 years. The member states are represented by the Council of Ministers, where each member state gets one vote in lawmaking. And finally, the Commission protects the interest of the Union as a whole. We realised that was quite a lot of complex theoretical stuff, but good job if you've made it through this far. Let's do a quick summary before moving on. The EU is not a state, and therefore it's not sovereign, and its powers must be conferred or given to it. The Union may make laws and bind sovereign states in areas in which it's been made competent by the member states through the signing of the Lisbon Treaty. Because the EU is not meant to rule as a state, it cannot have an executive, legislative, and judiciary. Instead, it's structured in such a way to respect the sovereignty of member states, while also being capable of representing its citizens and protecting itself. So then, how are laws actually made in the EU? How can the EU use the competences it has to create laws? Unlike national parliaments, the European Parliament has no power of initiative. It's the Commission who initiates the lawmaking. It discusses things with all kinds of civil organisations, experts and national governments, and with their help forms an idea of something which requires a common rule throughout the Union. So then it formulates this into a proposal. In that proposal, the Commission refers to which competence in the listed treaties it bases its proposal on. Essentially, it says why it has the right to rule in this area. If it oversteps its mark and breaches, the Council of Ministers or a member state may immediately bring a case to the European Court of Justice. That's how important competences are. The Commission must also explain why it believes that a matter is best dealt with by laws made at the Union level. This is because of another very important principle called subsidiarity. This means that everything must be regulated at the lowest possible level, as close to the citizens as possible. There's a mechanism in place to protect the principle of subsidiarity. The Commission must send every proposal to all national parliaments. They then have up to 8 weeks to submit their so-called reasoned opinion on whether or not the proposal complies with the subsidiarity principle or not. If a third of members or more think that the rules are not best made at the EU level, then the Commission has to abide by these complaints and must amend the proposal, withdraw it, or come up with its own reasoned opinion of why the proposal should be maintained. All documents are then sent to the European Parliament and Council of Ministers, who then take it to a vote. If the Parliament gives a majority in favour of the complaining member states, or if the Council of Ministers gives a 55% majority in favour, then the proposal is dead. However, most of the time the Commission is careful when it makes a proposal, to avoid all of these complications. That means that things normally go a lot more smoothly. If the competence is there, and no one complains about the subsidiarity, the proposal goes to the European Parliament. They then get to vote to pass the proposal, propose amendments, or reject it altogether. If they propose amendments, then the proposal goes back to the Commission, who may again accept, propose amendments, or reject. This way, a proposal usually ping-pongs back and forth a couple of times until the Commission and Parliament get something they're both satisfied with, an official draft. Then there's the final hurdle. The Council of Ministers comes together. Each member state may send one minister. Depending on the type of issue, they'll all be ministers of finance, or ministers of public health, or whichever topic is relevant to the law being discussed. They then must reach a majority to accept or reject. Most areas can be agreed with a qualified majority, though some areas like tax or police cooperation are particularly delicate. So in those cases, unanimity is required for the laws to pass. And again, the treaties set out what type of agreement is needed to pass the laws. Congratulations, you now know how the Union makes its laws, and are capable of explaining how one of the most complex though interesting institutions in the world functions. Do you think the EU is structured well? Is it democratic enough, or does it need changing somewhere? And if so, where and why? Leave your comments down below. You can also get involved in the conversation over on Discord. There's a link to the server down below, and by joining you can take part in discussions about all kinds of topics, from European politics and Brexit to gaming and philosophy. There's over 1,000 people on the server at the moment discussing a variety of topics from all kinds of different perspectives, so if you want to get involved in the conversation and discuss our videos, then that's the place to do it. Also, we've got a special channel on there exclusively for Patreon backers. So if you happen to be one of our backers on Patreon, you can get exclusive access to this special channel, where you can talk directly to Team TLDR and other Patreon backers. Join the over 1,000 people on the server and join the conversation today. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want further updates on the EU. Be sure to hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video. Also, if you want more from us across all social networks, then just search for TLDR News.